Hey guys, what's going on? Jacob here. So last time we started to learn how to use CSS. We found out how to select elements, add rules, and hook it into our HTML file. Today we're going to learn more advanced topics like creating page layouts and building menus. And we're finally going to start creating cool things on the page. So let's get started. So before we start talking about positioning and creating layouts, we need to discuss the box model in CSS. The box model plays a big part in positioning elements on the page. Every HTML element is considered a box and has a height and width and consists of actual content, padding, borders, and margins. The base of the box model is the actual content. Next is the padding, which is the space between the content and the edge of the element. So if I have a div with text inside of it, and the div has a padding of 20 pixels, it will look like this. Then comes the border, which is exactly what it sounds like, a border around the element. And on a side note, by default, these three parts are calculated separately when coming up with the element's height and width. So if I have a 100 pixel by 100 pixel div with 20 pixels of padding and a 5 pixel border, the total size of the div is going to be 125 pixels by 125 pixels. But if you give the div a box sizing property of border box, then those three parts are calculated together. So now if we have that same box and we add that rule, the total size of the div is going to be 100 pixels. And now our actual content in that div is going to be 75 pixels by 75 pixels. And finally we have the margin, which controls the space between elements. So if I have this gallery of images, I can make it look nice by adding a margin of 10 pixels to each image. Next, we have to position the elements. There are 5 ways that we can do this: relative, absolute, fixed, static, and sticky. Relative position is the most common type of position. This keeps the element within the flow of the page, but you can use the top, bottom, right, and left rules to move the element relative to its position on the page. The next most used positioning is absolute position. This is where the element is positioned absolutely relative to its next closest ancestor. That means the CSS will look for a parent element that has the defined position that's not static, and then it will position the element relative to that parent. So if there's no parent element with a defined position, it'll be positioned relative to the body. One of the best examples of this is when you're trying to create overlays for images. To do that, first create a parent div with a class of image, and then add the image, then create a span with the class of image overlay and some text. Then in the CSS, I give the div a position of relative and the span a position of absolute, with 100%, height of 30 pixels, bottom of 0, background of black, and the text color of white. Next is the fixed position. This works similar to absolute position. But the element is positioned relative to the viewport or browser rather than another element on the page. So if we had a div of a fixed position, top 0 with 100%, it would be stuck to the top of the page no matter how far we scroll down. You typically see this with menus that stick to the top of the page as you scroll down, or in those annoying videos on news sites that were made in the lower corner as you scroll down. The sticky position bounces between relative and fixed positions. The element is relative until the page reaches a defined offset position and then becomes fixed. But beware, IE and Edge don't support this, and Safari requires a prefix in front of the rule in order for it to run. Honestly, rigging up some JavaScript to do the same functionality is probably going to be your best bet. And finally, the default position is the static position. This keeps the element where it is in the flow of the page, and it cannot be affected by top, bottom, right, or left rules. The next part of creating layouts is floating elements, and we do that with the float rule. The float rule allows you to move an item to the left or right of a parent element. This is common with images and text, but as you'll see in a minute, it can also be used to create page layouts. You can center an item by giving it a float of none, which is the default, and by giving it a right to left margin of auto. Also related to floats is the clear rule. This denotes what can and cannot be next to an element. So a clear left means that no elements are allowed to the left. Right means that no elements are allowed to the right. Both means no elements allowed to the left or right, and none means elements are allowed on both sides. I also want you to know about clear fix. When you float an element to left or right, you take it out of the flow of the page a bit, and its height no longer affects the parent element's height, which can create some issues. So if you add this CSS and give the parent element a class of clearfix, this resolves this weird height issue. Okay, so remember that page that we created last time we're now going to style that page. But before we do that, there are a few HTML changes that we need to make. First, you're going to wrap the heading, content, image, and form in a div with an ID of main section. Then create a div outside of the other div with an ID of sidebar. We're then going to move the list that we created to inside of this new div. And now we're ready for our CSS. So we're going to create a CSS file inside of our directory and name it main.css. Then for the main div, give it a width of 75%, relative position, and float it to the left. For the sidebar, give it a width of 25%, relative position, and float it to the right. And give it a background color, maybe an off-white color. And bam, now you have a layout on the page. Yes, this is a super simple example, but it's the basics for any page layout. Now let's talk about hiding and showing elements, which is done via the visibility and display rules. The visibility rule has two possible values: hidden and visible. Hidden hides the element, but the space where the element once was is saved, leaving a hole on the page. Visible makes the element, well, visible. Display does something similar, but it goes beyond that. Display none essentially removes the element from the page. It's still there in the HTML, but its space on the page is removed. But you can do a lot more with display. Display block makes the element a block element. Display inline makes the element an inline element. And display inline block makes the element an inline element, but it can also have a height and width. So sort of a hybrid of the two. So now let's try to put all this knowledge to the test by creating a dynamic menu. So to do that, we're going to need to create an unordered list with links to other pages. And inside of some of these list items, we're going to nest some other lists as well to create a dynamic menu. Once we're done with the HTML, let's pop on over to the page in the browser. It looks ugly, but when we're done, it will look better. So now in our CSS, the first thing we need to do is to get rid of the default styles. So for the UL element, we're going to get rid of the margin left, and for the LI element, we're going to get rid of the dots by using list style none. Note, list style can make those dots squares, triangles, empty squares, or something else. Next, we need to hide the nested list or submenus. So make the UL hidden with display none. Then we need a way to see the submenus when we hover over their parent list item. And to do that, we'll use the hover pseudo class on the LI element and then set display to block. But this brings up an issue. If you hover over an element with a submenu that also holds a submenu, all those submenus appear when we just want that first one to appear. So, to only target the direct child elements, we use a greater than sign between the LI and UL selectors in the CSS. Now we're going to make this a horizontal menu, and to do that, we need to use the float left for the list elements. And then for the third level items, let's give them a bit of an indentation. Now let's take a look at our menu. In terms of how good it looks, it's not great. There's really no styling, but functionally it works. Now you can go and add in backgrounds, borders, and other things on your own. I think that you'll find that you'll learn much better and quicker by doing. So that's all for today. Next time we'll talk about CSS transitions. In the meantime, do you have any questions over what we went over today? If so, please leave them down in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. But until next time, good luck and happy coding.